States. And increasingly, countries are embroiled in irregular warfare, where they find it difficult and almost impossible to capture individuals in charge of individual cells, because they're hiding in countries like, for example, Syria, where we can't get them because we have no status cooperations with those countries, or in countries with allies but who are suspect like Pakistan, or in failed states like Somalia, where it's nearly impossible for us to use conventional methods to get them. In the context where we can't get these individuals, where conventional methods have proven to fail, we argue and we suggest on this side that it's important for us to allow them to be allowed to use bounty hunters to capture or kill these individuals whose very existence poses a threat to thousands upon thousands in the modern world. Make no qualms about it. States across the world are already doing this via their secret operations, like for example the Mossad or the CIA, but we want to extend it to include bounty hunters as well. And we're going to prove to you why it's necessary. Under our policy, we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to allow them to hire bounty hunters who are usually local soldiers with some kind of military background or independent contractors from within that country to capture or kill individuals who are high on the list of the FBI, people like Zarqawi and formerly Osama bin Laden, whose very existence poses or puts thousands of people to risk because they can mastermind operations and attacks on people or societies in the modern world. Secondly, what we're going to do is that we're going to go and operate on a capture-first basis and as fast as possible get them captured and then put them on trial, and only kill when it's necessary. Just like what we did with Eichmann, who was complicit in the Holocaust, who the Mossad took the active attempt to capture and not immediately kill. Third, we think that if they fail, if we give them the explicit command to capture the individual, but they kill the individual for no reason besides the fact that they just want to, what we're going to do is that we're not going to pay these individuals at all. And if we have to, we'll put them on trial anyway, and put them to trial for the kind of atrocities that they be complicit with. A couple of clarifications first. Firstly, we think that we're talking about contexts where conventional means don't work, where we aren't able to get cooperation from the states who are actively hiding these individuals, or where the states who we are necessarily allied with aren't necessarily cooperating to the level that's required for us to deal with these individuals. And also we're talking about a context where war is no longer a viable means. Not only are people largely averse to the idea of war, as can be seen from the reaction against the military presence in Libya against Obama, but we think also that war was never a good option to begin with, that we think it leads to disastrous consequences. See Afghanistan, see Iraq. Secondly, we think that SEAL Team 6 and all these other options will still remain, but we are going to give the ability for these countries to choose between such operations and such cells and also the bounty hunters. Third, and we're going to make it extremely clear here, we don't propose that we're going to solve terrorism. We think that it requires a lot more effort. The issue and debate here is whether these individuals or these nation states should be given the right to explore the use of bounty hunters as a viable option to capture these individuals where it's hard for them or impossible for them to get these individuals who pose a threat. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things. First, we're going to discuss to what extent can a state protect itself, and arguments, and we're going to have a little chat about the ideas of justice and who serves it better. Secondly, we're going to talk about bureaucracy and why we think we can suspend the normal rules that apply in normal life, and why we think it's necessary for us to circumvent bureaucracy in these instances, and why we still have a good check and balance in place to ensure it's not abused. And third, we're going to argue and prove to you why we need this as a policy option in addition to the SEAL Team 6 option that's already available. So first, to what extent can the state protect itself? We make the radical proposition that the state's primary obligation is to ensure the basic security and welfare of its people, and that its primary obligation is to do whatever is necessary to protect these individuals. Now, in the context where it's impossible for them to do this, we think, and the only way for them to protect these individuals is for them to circumvent certain laws or certain regulations or certain systems of bureaucracy, we think that it's warranted and they have every right to do so, especially in the specific context that we're looking at today. Firstly, that the individuals that we're looking at works within the limitations that are commonplace within the international framework to ensure that normal state actors cannot get them. They hide in countries like, for example, Syria, they hide in countries like, for example, Somalia, where normal conventional forces, where normal conventional methods find it impossible to get them out of their country and to get them tried in a court of law, to get them and hold them responsible for the acts that they are guilty of. And we're talking about people largely where there's a degree of overlapping consensus and to a degree of certainty that they're responsible for the acts that they committed that largely don't have to be clarified in a court of law. Secondly, we're talking about individuals in a very unique position in the sense that they force huge several nation states into a state of war, right? Where they force individuals didn't even consent to any form of war, who didn't even consent to any form of risk, to the repercussions of warfare. And we think these are individuals who have implicitly consented to the possibility that they might lose their lives as a result, that they might be captured as a result of their provocation of this war and foisting this war upon first world liberal states. We understand and we preempt the discussion coming from the other side, that justice might necessarily be the most important consideration that this House can consider. But when we're talking about these individuals, we think first and foremost we're going to ensure that we capture these individuals and not kill them as fast as possible. We're going to make sure that we get them to the court of law. But even if these people are killed, like I said earlier, there's already a degree of consensus that's been established that these individuals do pose a threat to the modern society, are masterminds of individual cells who continuously attack societies and cities, like for example in Israel. The second point, the idea of bureaucracy and why we think we can circumvent them. We think when it comes to bureaucracy, we suggest two important points. Firstly, we don't think that it's necessary for us to work with any form of partners or allies to get these individuals, especially if these allies may necessarily undermine our military efforts. The reason why Barack Obama didn't tell the Pakistani federal government, didn't tell the Zardari government that they were going after Osama bin Laden was for the fear of leaks. We're not saying that these states are necessarily complicit in a terrorist act, but we think that the possibility of leaks in and of itself is not a risk that we can take. Secondly, when it comes to things of example, security issues, we think that the state has the obligation to end the mandate to act or be independent in taking out whatever is necessary to take out these insidious elements. Like for example, Obama operated a platform that whenever he saw a terrorist, he would go for them actively, and the people consented to the idea that he should be given all the authority to go for individuals like Osama bin Laden, and we think we have a consensus of the people as well. But beyond that, we think there are better checks on our side. First and foremost, we think that if soldiers, for example, those in SEAL Team 6, were to commit any form of atrocities, we think it will be near impossible for us to try them in a court of law and get them responsible for those acts, especially with the cocoon of heroism that surrounds these military soldiers in these countries who are on the forefront against terrorism. Secondly, we think that when it comes to the idea of abuse, it usually boils down to the idea of them constantly using this method to take away individuals who they're unhappy with. We make again the suggestion on this side that states won't naturally resort in and abuse this option, because we think there's the paranoia that if they are to be found, there'll be massive resentment from the electorate, that we reject that, and we think there's a natural incentive for these people. Why do we need this? First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, we think that largely SEAL Team 6 and all these military people and personnel don't know the terrain nearly as well as individuals within that state, and we think that we can overcome this particular obstacle by allowing them to hire bounty hunters. Secondly, we think that when you find and you catch someone with the US flag on his arm, we think it's seen as a visceral assault upon the sovereignty of that state, which comes with massive repercussions that we don't think that individuals or these states can necessarily endorse or support. And for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, this important motion must stand.
Thank you everyone for that speech. We now invite the first negative speaker from Victoria 1, Sebastian Templeton.
It is never okay to breach the core principles of international and of human fabric. The core principles which underpin everything that we stand for, and the core principles which, if breached, play straight into the hands of the very people that side of the House wants to be executing and wants to be capturing in such a horrifying manner. And that's why when he stood up and in his introduction he recognised that every day more insurgents were being recruited. Al-Shabaab is recruiting, he said. Al-Qaeda is recruiting, he said. And further to that, we know that the sorts of proposals that they support are already happening on the ground. It's very, very easy to see why those particular groups are recruiting. Because the West is no longer standing up for its principles. We want it to stand up for those principles. We do not want to give an excuse to terrorists, and we think that we're proud, therefore, to stand for those principles. So that's what we do on the side of opposition today. We stand for all of the principles of international law. We oppose any extrajudicial assassination. We oppose any non-military capture. We stand for all of the principles enshrined in various Geneva conventions and all of the international bodies in the International Criminal Court. We would like to do things in a normal way. We accept it's not happening at the moment. We do not want that. That means that we're fine with legitimate wars. We're fine with trials and outcomes of those trials. We are not okay with SEAL Team 6, and we're fine when capture happens under military control and advised by the Geneva Convention. What I'm going to do at first, I'm going to talk about the practices being principally wrong, secondly, what our problems specifically are with bounty hunters, and thirdly, why we think that there will be backlash, which actually undermines the goals which they set out to solve. And then second, Richard's going to talk about the crucial point that we erode intergovernmental cooperation in a number of ways when we act in the way that side proposition want us to. First of all, there are 4 points of response. The first one is this analysis that they gave us about people being averse to war, and so they want to give government some choice that they otherwise don't have by circumventing public demand. That is absolutely the worst form of control, to give governments who represent people, and to give governments who are the governments in this debate, who stand for representation of people, who stand for fair and liberal democratic ideals, the very, very governments that stand against terrorism in that ideal and in undermining that ideal instantly to fight them, they do very, very detrimental things and they're big harms. Secondly, though, we just simply do not want violence mongering. We do not think if the public wants to go to war, the public should have to fund an army that represents them or fund mercenaries that represent them through the mechanism that they propose. We think that that's harmful. Secondly, though, their principle was effectively that the ends justify the means. If that is their principle, one which we think is abhorrent anyway, then they need to stand up and analyse for us why the ends are perpetuated through the means that they put in place, because we think that that's the harm. That's my third point about backlash. Third point of response, and this was essentially that all of these people have some degree of consensus around their need to be killed, so it's okay to do that. 2 points of response to that. The first one is, obviously there is no degree of consensus around these people needing to be killed, because they want to circumvent people having to go to their citizens in order to get a mandate for the military to kill these people. There is no consensus around that, but they also want to run the argument that they want to circumvent it. Secondly, though, he went on from this and started talking about Osama being able to unilaterally go into Pakistan, and that'd be a good thing that we don't tell the Pakistanis that we're going into the country to execute some of their citizens. Again, if we don't want to tell the people whose countries we are invading with mercenaries, then there is no consensus that these are the sort of people that we want to have killed. We do not agree with consensus, we do not agree with circumvention. The final point to discuss is leaks and accountability. And their point here was essentially that the military is very, very leaky, and it's more important that we just have one source going in, a number of responses again. First of all, Blackwater has proven in a number of scenarios to be far more leaky. And how are they leaking? They have all of the information, and it's not operated with the command structure that would occur in the military, where grunts do not have the information about the wider mechanism of what they're doing in that country. They simply are following orders. Blackwater have all of the information when they go to countries. They're more likely to be leaky through that. And secondly, when you give Blackwater or another private mercenary or bounty hunter group the ability to go in and act unilaterally, the government has plausible deniability. So the government can say, we had nothing to do with that. They weren't acting for us, they might have been acting for the Europeans, they might have been acting for anyone else. And when there is plausible or actual deniability for the government, there is no accountability whatsoever, as opposed to when military soldiers are held to account. First of all, then, about their practices being principally wrong. And we've discussed to a strong degree already why we think international and criminal military law is undermined. Principles such as treating people as enemy combatants, such as notifying states of combat, such as upholding fair and legitimate trials, all of those are undermined. But those are particularly important because at wartime, countries are pushed to the absolute limits, and we need to ensure that when they are pushed to the limits, there are limits there which they never ever erode, and that side of the house is happy to erode them. And in fact, they want to erode them in a way where none of the public paying to erode them even know that they're paying in the first place. We think that that's harmful. That means that the authority often comes from the conscience in these scenarios of the people following them, and we need states to always follow them, otherwise those principles fall away, and otherwise terrorism actually does become a legitimate way of exercising foreign diplomacy. Finally, though, at this point, we think that these principles are breached in a number of ways by their proposals. So first of all, just the fact that there are non-state actors means that you cannot take these people to any particular government and change that government for it. It means you can't take them to the ICC. It means that you can't hold them to account under all of the conventions that the governments have signed. It means that there is absolutely no accountability for these people. And so the principles can be breached, and the principles mean nothing when these people step in and operate in these particular ways. Secondly, though, the whole reason that they want to propose this motion is actually to avoid the principles of war, because they want something that the military can't do. They want to operate outside of that, and we say those principles, therefore, are undermined very, very quickly. Secondly, then, let's talk about bounty hunters specifically, the sorts of people that they want to talk about. Who are these people? These are people who, most of the time, are ex-military or ex-secret service. These are people who have done something wrong, which means that they are no longer in those particular organisations. So they've actually changed the way that they operate in some particular way. A number of things that they could have done. They may have failed psychometric tests, as has been the case with a number of the Blackwater operatives. They may have failed to follow orders. They may have lost their national allegiance. They may have done a number of things which means they're no longer in the particular organisation which trained them. So yes, they are good soldiers, but no, they're not good at following any sorts of commands. They are clearly people who operate outside of the law. And now they're people who are motivated purely by auctioning off their talents and by operating in a way which is less morally constrained than soldiers if they were not able to operate in a way which is less morally constrained by soldiers, and soldiers themselves would be okay. What are the particular problems with this? The first one is a discussion of command and control. These are people who are more likely to go wrong because these are people who are not beholden to generals, and in fact who are able to make decisions themselves because they have more information on the ground. So instead of accountability to a government, these are people with accountability to employers, and those employers have specific goals of efficiency, those employers have specific goals of ensuring that what happens on the ground is particularly in their interest, and that means that there's a lack of respect for human life. So it is more likely that a mercenary throws a grenade into a house instead of invading that house, because that mercenary's life is important to them and it's important to their operatives, whereas for a general person on the ground, a grunt, a military soldier, they would not take that action because that action would lead them to court-martial. Secondly then, about personal interests, and I've already alluded to this. These people have personal interests. These people want to stay alive. They've proven that they want to stay alive because they've moved out of the ordinary structures where they have no control over that particular life, and there is no ability to court-martial such people. These are people who act with an international liability shield. And finally, these are people who have no macro understanding of the war, and this is exactly what happened with the CIA in a number of circumstances with drones. People gave to them drones to operate in Pakistan, and they did that on the minor level, on the level that they were given, very, very well. The problem is they didn't understand the more macro wartime decisions that had been made, such that they should not be killing Pakistani citizens. While they were good at doing what they were asked to do within their specific contract, they had no understanding of the wider war effort and what was important strategically in that. Finally, talking about backlash, you give a lot of credit to the sort of rhetoric that the people that we want to stamp out use when you say, we are the West, we stand for these principles, and we have a number of ways of circumventing these principles. And a lot of the people going in and performing these operations are obviously going to be Western operatives, given that they are targeting people who the West publicly and apparently universally says are needed people. That means that it undermines the principles, but it secondly means you don't just make terrorist perspectives believed, you actually make terrorist perspectives just and correct in the scenarios on the ground, because the West no longer stands for its principles. It's legitimate to fight in this particular way. That side of the House needs to stand up and understand why they are playing into the hands of terrorists, why they are going against everything that we think is important, and doing so in a way which does not address the desires of the public who stand in opposition.
Thank you very much, sir, for that speech. We now invite the second affirmative speaker from NUS 1, Sadhana Raya.
Every single person in this room is a walking target of terrorism. Either because you're a Western ally, either because you have a military base in your country, or either because you're part of an ideological war. There's a pressing need to rid ourselves of terrorism that's embedded in the deepest hearts of this world. In Yemen, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in a countless number of places. Where there is no stomach for war, where there is no internal political will to clamp down on a lot of these individual terrorists, when we don't want to see dead Navy SEALs being dragged through streets, what do we do? Where existing state mechanism cannot accommodate these terrorists, where existing state mechanisms cannot accommodate dealing with these terrorists, should bounty hunters be used? We told you clearly they should. We told you we don't want to brave the costs of extreme warfare, which we already see existing in this world today. We told you there's a need to be able to clamp down on a lot of these terrorists without having to brave the costs of dead people, both Americans or other Western allies, and in the home countries of these terrorists. They never came back to their pressing urge. All they told us was this: it's important to stick to principles because that's how we use support. The war on hearts and minds, and that's my first point of contention, is won through economic development. It's won through aid. It's won through helping people. But where other countries threaten you, where other countries threaten and don't subscribe to the same principles that you subscribe to, that's when it's okay to deviate from those principles. We don't think, in fact, it's a deviation from those principles. We think it's precisely what protects liberal democracy. We think that where there's a threat against a country, where people don't see eye to eye with the very same principles you wish to espouse, that's why states take a practical approach towards dealing with terrorism, towards protecting their own people. On the second level, they then said the public should not have to fund mercenaries. We say yes, they shouldn't have to fund wars either, but they do, because it's pressing and it's important for a lot of these states to protect and secure their people, to protect and secure against even the social costs that come from terrorism. We think that that point is moot. On the third level, and this is on the point of consent, they said Pakistan or Syria didn't consent to this. We said that it's not important. Terrorists, by virtue of the fact that they engage in this kind of warfare, consented to it. On the second level, we didn't consent to terrorism either, yet it's being waged against us. When these countries refuse to cooperate, we think that is enough of a factor to mitigate consent. We think it's even worse when you, without their consent, invade them through warfare. And that's my third point of response to the idea that Pakistan or Syria didn't consent. Where you have an existing threat by another nation against, for example, America, the push to engage in warfare to protect Americans, for example, to protect countries that suffer from these threats, is extremely strong. That's where you have people engaging in full-out warfare. That's where you mitigate consent even more. That's where you have even greater harms. But on the third level, they then talk on the third point of contention. They then talked about accountability, and the accountability point is on two levels. First of all, accountability on part of the state, and second of all, accountability on part of bounty hunters. Let's talk about accountability on part of the state. First of all, they said people don't know what the government is doing, so there is no accountability, they can't check it. Well, first of all, we think people already consent to a certain degree of state protection. They recognize that they may not be able to know everything that the state does, but they consent to it because they recognize that it's important for the state to be able to conduct certain covert actions in pursuit of greater security of citizens and of the nation as a whole. On the second level, we think that when these individuals actually get killed, that's when the accountability comes in. If they refuse or they believe that this sort of an action is not within the ideological dogma that is subscribed to, they can simply vote the person out. On the last level, we think this is exactly the ideological dogma that people subscribe to. They don't wish to say, oh, based on principle, we think Osama shouldn't have been murdered. We think these people want terrorists to be dead, and in fact, the push for the attack on terrorism is so strong that it drives countries to war. We want to give them an alternative such that you don't suffer the kind of costs that are accrued when war occurs. On the second level, we think that accountability on part of the bounty hunters can be assured. On the second part of accountability, we think it can be assured on part of bounty hunters. On the first level, we think that we're only going to engage people who adhere to the contract. We definitely will have a process that screens out individuals who have been criminals, for example. On the second level, we don't think that they will go rogue. And even if they do, we think just as we try PMCs, we will be perfectly capable of trying a lot of these individuals. We think we have a certain degree of control. And in fact, the incentive to get paid is an even greater degree of control. But let's look at your alternative when you talk about, for example, waging war. We think soldiers, it's even harder to try soldiers in court than it is to try a lot of these bounty hunters, a lot of these PMCs. So we don't think that point stands. Now let's move on to the substantive for today. How this harms terrorist cells and which are predicated upon the network of trust. I've already gone into this in certain detail. First of all, terrorist cells are predicated upon a network and a system of trust amongst its members. So by introducing the element of bounty hunters, we think it will make it more dangerous for them to trust anyone within their circle or for them to expand their circle. Now, how do terrorist cells work? We think that precisely because they cannot use the internet or the telephone, it's based on a personal network of trust amongst locals and amongst people that they hire through, I don't know, by incentivizing them to join and then training them based on the ideological dogma that they induce them into. Now we think on the first level, because this large trust, network of trust is predicated upon the ability to be able to share information and trust each other, by introducing a new element, we increase the degree of distrust between the terrorist cells in that network. We think that's important because it affects their ability to trust the local landscape when conducting their operations. On the second level, we think now it's important that we manage to disincentivize a lot of people from joining terrorism. They'll come and tell you terrorism is an ideological war. People are convinced by it because they believe in the dogma. That's not the case with Ajmal Kasab, who joined terrorist networks simply because he was paid to do so. We think this is a disincentive. Now they recognize that people can be disincentivized from joining the terrorist networks. It harms the level of trust within the network. Similar to how spies do, similar to how other forms of infiltration do. On the second level, we think that this policy deals with the political pressure for war and against war by providing an alternative where no solution is possible. We think that when you have conservative, hawkish politicians willing to push for war, who is willing to play on the fear of a lot of individuals, that's where you have political maneuvering that pushes for one of the many solutions, which is war, because there simply is no way to infiltrate these countries. Our solution provides a lot of these politicians with the one way to infiltrate with low human costs, low economic costs, and on an overall scale prevents the maneuvering of a lot of these of the war effort in these countries. No one likes to see America lose. No one likes to see their soldiers lose, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of the day, when such things happen and it's splashed across newspapers, that's when the war effort fails. Bounty hunters remove that possibility. War efforts remain a lot more stable. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, Sadhana, for that speech. We now invite the second negative speaker, Victoria 1, Richard Diaz.
To outsource our military to the lowest cost provider is to sell our principles and our morality for little more than a fistful of coin. We destroy our ability to guarantee against the barbarism we test to fight against. We destroy our ability to conduct just war, and we destroy the very strategic principles that we are trying to fight for and win. We on the Negator team cannot condone this. Yes, it is hard to capture and kill these people, but the ends in this case do not justify the means. 4 reasons why. The first one is that this is abhorrent and against the very principles that justify us fighting this war in the first place. The second thing is that bounty hunters are odious criminals in waiting, cannot be trusted, and will, we guarantee, commit atrocities. Thirdly, we say this will bring upon the hatred of the very people whose hearts and minds we need to win if we ever want to end this war on terror. And fourthly, will ensure the state cooperation we need can never occur. Let's start with morality. We gave you a very clear case as to why these moral principles, the rules of war, the actual foundational principles of international humanitarian and criminal law were so important, because we said that they are based on collective morality, the idea that the only thing enforcing these rules is the belief that they exist and the belief that they should be followed. In a situation where states are pushed to the very edge of their fabric, that is when you need those principles the most. And when you start dismissing them, getting rid of them because it's inconvenient to follow them, that's when you fatally undermine them. And they essentially conceded this. They conceded the harms these principles suffered, and they actually asserted that we should be actually trying to actively undermine them because we can't rely on the public to fight our unjust war. We think that by abandoning these principles, by having people to which there is no recourse under international law, people who act with essential impunity, who will bring no shame on the countries who use them because of the plausible deniability point that Seth gave you they didn't respond to, people who will basically kill and assassinate and murder people, we destroy those very principles. What do we hear in response to this principle analysis from that side of the house? The first thing we heard is that these people are dangerous, that they're apparently so well hidden in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan that we need to breach our principles to capture them. What they missed, though, is that there's a fundamental continuum between security and an effectiveness of that threat. Osama was very, very secure, but very ineffective at carrying out threats. The more terrorists are holed away and hard to get to, the less effective they are. So the very terrorists you're trying to capture are the least dangerous to us. The ones at the very edge of our operational abilities are the ones that we don't need to worry breaking our principles to try and get to. The second justification was international consensus, and we pointed out the absurdity of this. We said Pakistan doesn't consent, the own populations of these countries didn't consent, they had no reply to that. They said it was better than going to war, that we should avoid the cost of going to war if we use this principle instead. But we see if that war can be justified. If actually a situation like Afghanistan, where the state is actively aiding and abetting them, then wage a legal war. Go to the United Nations Security Council, get authorization to invade, and if you can't do that, go and circumvent the international law by using these alternative methods, just because you want to avoid the cost of war. Because for the people of Pakistan who are murdered in their beds by the grenades used by these mercenaries, it is still a war. Let's talk about the bounty hunters then, because even if they can't win the principled side, they will not win the practical side. We gave you multiple reasons why these people are odious criminals who cannot be trusted to operate in our strategic interests and will almost guarantee they will cause more harm than do any good. The first thing we said is that these people are not movie action heroes. These are people who have been kicked out of militaries in subordination for basically being freaking crazy, and we don't think those are the sort of people who we should be relying on to conduct operations. The second thing we said is that a direct consequence of that is a lack of command and control. And soldiers who are acting in their own interest, who don't follow orders, who have a history of insubordination, are the very ones who go off the rails and commit atrocities. They're the ones who commit rape, they're the ones who commit murder, they're the ones who prioritise their paycheck above protecting human life when they invade compounds and try to secure these people. The only mechanism they took to bring accountability was that Western electorates would hold their governments to account. I'm sorry, you don't base fundamental rights on the will of a majority of voters voting on a lot of ideas to protect the rights of minorities, especially since those people don't have much of a stake in whether or not these people in Pakistan are getting raped or murdered. That's not a very good way to protect fundamental rights, and it's a way that we don't think we can condone. To further talk about mercenaries though, we told you that they can actually actively undermine our big picture strategic interests in these areas. They can take actions individually that harm our overall overarching goals. What responses do we have from that side of the house? The first one was an assertion that we can make contracts sufficiently strong to stop abuse. That relies on us being able to monitor the actions they're taking on the ground. Those very same accountability problems, the fact that we're not there alongside them because we're sending them in as crazy stealth assassins, means it's very hard to enforce the terms of the contract. The second thing is they asserted that apparently it's really hard to try soldiers in courts. No, it's not. Military court-martials exist. They're quite straightforward and happen all the time. The final thing we got there is that they'd be super effective at knocking out terrorist cells, because apparently now they're not just bounty hunters, they're stealth assassins who move into your terrorist cell and then make you not trust all your compatriots. I'm sorry, that's very unlikely. Terrorist cells probably scrutinise new members and check to see if they're mercenaries. We don't think that's tremendously plausible in the big picture. The next thing I want to talk about then is backlash, and this will lead into my substantive material in this debate. Because we said to actually win the war on terror, we can't just keep killing people until we've killed everyone who hates us. Because the problem is, by killing people, we make more people hate us. This is relatively straightforward analysis they really haven't had a response to in this debate. And the thing is, we think that the very acts of international criminality, the very acts of criminality perpetrated by these bounty hunters, are the very things that strike at the hearts and minds of people who are perhaps sympathetic to terrorists, or perhaps weren't sympathetic until a grenade was thrown through their window because they lived near Osama's house and they got blown up. We think that by making people hate us, which is what this policy will do, will pretty much destroy any ability to get good outcomes in the end. But let's talk about state activity, because a lot of debate in this has taken place in the context of Pakistan. And what we'd say, if you successfully want to engage in a war against people who are operating in a state who perhaps lacks the capacity or has internal factionalisation, which means it lacks the capacity to engage with them, you need to start getting those state actors on board so they cooperate rather than oppose you. Why? Because in a place like Pakistan, where the ISI has a lot of personal power, and other factions in that group might hate certain other factions, you need to make sure that they don't actively undermine your operations. You need them to provide you with the information about where Osama is. The ISI knew, and they didn't tell us, because of the very things that give power to them, like our operation with impunity in their territory with drones. To start building that relationship with trust in Pakistan, to stop getting them on our side rather than working actively against us. That's when we start following our principles, respecting their sovereignty, stop murdering their people, not embarrassing them by demonstrating that we can send soldiers into the territory with impunity, not threatening their security interests by showing that we can act with impunity in their territory. We say by basically pursuing that policy, we guarantee that Pakistan and other similar countries actively work against us. They will never help us. They'll never tell us we're progress. They'll tip us off because we're breaching the very principles that they confirm to them that we're acting morally within their territory. We don't think that's something that is ever going to be acceptable and something that ever produce good outcomes on the ground for us. So, at this stage of the debate, where have we got to? We've got to an affirmative team that basically says because a problem is too hard, we should throw out everything that makes our side in this war legitimate and worth fighting for. That we should abandon the principles of international justice, the principles of international morality, the basic ideas of how we should treat people in this world for the sake of hopefully using these mercenaries to capture these people. But even below that, there's no chance they'll be effective. They're poor soldiers, they'll be aggressive soldiers, they'll be unaccountable soldiers, and that means that ultimately they'll do way more harm than good at the cost of our fundamental humanity.
We thank Richard for that speech. We now invite the third affirmative speaker from NUS 1, Robin Teo.
Yes? Okay. Now, only people who have never been in the military can be so glib as to say that their policy and their principles are so important that they will even go to war in order to uphold them, ladies and gentlemen. Going to war means more people die. There's 600,000 refugees in Iraq and hundreds of thousands dead from the chaos of the initial invasion go back to disagree with their policy. The millions of people who have been radicalized by America's war in Afghanistan and Iraq go back to oppose their particular policy, ladies and gentlemen. We think if our policy is one step towards avoiding war and make sure we can capture these people without causing the unintended consequences of war, then we think this particular policy is worth it. I'm going to look at two issues in this debate. First, the core issue, the right of states to protect its people and how far can it go to pursue that, and secondly, fighting the war on terror. How do we do it? How do we win, especially in circumstances where the individuals threatening to kill us? So firstly, the right of states to defend themselves. And they blatantly say that our policy violates the core principles of international law that necessitates us not doing this. We agree that there are certain things that we should not do in pursuit of security. Things like torture, things like war crimes, ladies and gentlemen. The problem with that side of the house is that the vast majority of those rules were constructed in a time where warfare was between states, where you know exactly who your enemies are. And that is where they have failed to grapple the case that Imran already brought to you. Firstly, these are people who specifically use the very loopholes in international law in order to threaten your lives by going to places like hostile states, like failed states, where you cannot possibly get to them, but they can still plan and maneuver to kill your particular citizens, ladies and gentlemen. We have also said when Osama bin Laden, when Zarqawi says that every single Muslim in the world has a duty to kill Americans, they have consented to going to war, and they have consented to the consequences of war, even though we still will torture or commit war crimes against them, ladies and gentlemen. That is critical, and because of that, we think bounty hunters who can capture or kill them are perfectly within the boundaries of international law. The second thing we talk about here is the citizens' right to know and how people should not have to fund terrorists. On the first level, we think that argument is predicated on the idea that citizens have complete knowledge of all military operations, which frankly is not true. Under the circumstances, they might as well abolish the CIA. There is a reason why there's redacted info. There's a reason why certain security information cannot be known to the public. If you know there's a terrorist, say OBL, and Abu Dhabi, and you reveal it to the public to deliberate whether or not we should go in or not, by the time the public has decided, and you know how long America can take, Osama bin Laden would be long gone, ladies and gentlemen. That is why under certain circumstances, all you need is a general mandate. And let's be clear that the United States has that general mandate. Obama, I beg your pardon, was voted into office on the premise that Osama bin Laden is in another sovereign state and is threatening American lives. We will go in there and we will get them. We are following the will of the people. They are not. Under these circumstances, we stand by the right of states to protect themselves when people are trying to kill them. And they would use every single means in their disposal to do so if they could. Let's then move on to the second issue, the issue of the war on terror. Many points here. The first issue that we brought, which should have been the focus of this debate, is the
there are individuals living in these unreachable areas like Syria, like Somalia, planning to kill our citizens, people like Zakawi and who knows how many. They propose no solution whatever to go after them, ladies and gentlemen. That is, we agree that these people are holed away. They claim because they're holed away, they're not dangerous. That is just not true. These people who are holed away and secure are precisely the people who are the masterminds of the very terrorist attacks that we need to stop. And that is why capturing them is an even bigger imperative. Secondly, if we follow their consensus and have a deliberation every time we decide whether or not to go in there, every time the public is alerted when someone is there, they would have gone away by the time we know. We think that it's injurious to our ability to capture these particular individuals. And thirdly, and this is incredibly important, we think their policy will ensure the political push to war will be even greater. Now in the status quo, there is always a section of nut jobs in the United States, like John McCain, I'm sorry if anyone likes him, or Joe Lieberman, who always want war. And they always play on fear, ladies and gentlemen. And fear is very easily played when people know that Osama bin Laden is still alive, and he is still there, and the state is powerless. That is when the push for military action is great. And we think as much as they say that sometimes wars can be honorable, in the modern day age of asymmetrical warfare, even if the United Nations consent, the consequences are still intolerable, ladies and gentlemen. Look at Somalia, which was sanctioned by the United Nations. Look at the first Gulf War, which led to the suppression of the Kurdish and Shia population within Iraq. Under most circumstances, we think insofar as we can, we want to avoid all-out warfare. Lastly, they have never engaged in Sana's case. They show how we force these terrorists to become even more isolated because terrorists work on a system of trust. They expand their networks on a system of trust. The only way they can carry out massive attacks in the West through things like 9/11 is the massive systems of communication and absolute trust between each other. Once they know that anyone within that circle might potentially be about to try to infiltrate that particular circle in order to capture them, their ability to expand and carry out attacks on us will be worsened. Never dealt with by that side of the house. Next, they talk about cooperation, how international cooperation is good, and we undermine it. Firstly, if that state is willing to cooperate with us, damn right we will cooperate with them. We're talking about situations where they might not. On the second level, there are limits to cooperation. We cooperated with the Zanawi government for 9 or 10 years, and they allow Osama bin Laden to stay alive in the very Abbottabad, the very center of the Pakistani military establishment. Clearly, cooperation sometimes doesn't get you your guy, and sometimes alternatives are warranted. The next issue they talked about here was accountability. They've painted this very cute cartoon picture of these individuals as the scum of the earth who necessarily and all or pathological killers who are evil. On the first level, we think we have one contracts that can necessarily screen people to make sure these people are not evil. But secondly, we think Iman is developing a very clear system of accountability by which we can check on their behavior. Firstly, if people work on their money, work on the basis of pay, and if they violate the rules of the contract, they will not be paid, never dealt with by them. Secondly, we can try them just like how we tried PMCs, like Blackwater for instance, and MXC for instance, never dealt with by them, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, we also say that states will inherently be careful in doing this because if they keep doing this over and over again, it will necessarily lose its effectiveness. And lastly, even if there is crime within the military, we think there always are cases of leaks within the military establishment. There will always be another man of conscience, like Bradley Manning, willing to tell people if their atrocity is being perpetrated by the military establishment. Conversely, they've never dealt with what we say, that their existing system is not that hot either, because the US military, despite the presence of court-martial, is incredibly difficult to try, ladies and gentlemen. The degree of fraternity in the military is immense, and it's very likely the US government and US military will put on trial a person who broke the rules of engagement just to get Osama bin Laden. We don't think they will necessarily be able to do that. We present you with a system of accountability that they have not grappled with. Lastly, I'm going to talk about this issue of hearts and minds and the backlash that will be engendered. On the first level, we just don't think this is the main issue. We're talking about individuals who are already radicalized, who already want to kill us. They've never given us a mechanism by which we get these particular people. On the second level, we think the battle of hearts and minds can best be won through other areas like economic development in the Middle East, like the Arab Spring actually succeeding in bringing democracy and modernity to the Middle East. And when they propose going towards alternative measures, they set back all these particular areas of progress, ladies and gentlemen, because there's nothing that will turn hearts and minds more against you than going to war, even if it's sanctioned by the United Nations. That is why we think that our policy is fundamentally necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, every single person in this hall is a target of terrorists. And as far as we are concerned if our policy can get us more dangerous terrorists, keep more people here secure, and ensure that we do not bear the horrific consequences of war, we are immensely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that speech. We now invite the third negative speaker from Victoria 1, Udian Mukherjee.
Ladies and gentlemen, the war on terror is a war of ideology, but it's also a war and with this very ideology infuse every action we take. We have principles in the West we hold dear, and we think that we should be a significantly high threshold before we cash them in for short-term gain, before we outsource them to mercenaries who think that they're going to do far greater violence to our long-term strategic goals. At the end of this debate, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to show you why the scaremongering alternatives of a 9/11 attack or like long warfare every time there are terrorists in the state that we can't capture don't actually obtain in this debate. Then I'm going to show you what the main harms of the case are, which is that we have unaccountable private soldiers who are likely to do things which are more brutal than the military because of the command structures that are different. Then I'm going to show you why it is that given that fact, their proposal actually deepen and strengthen the opposition to us and make the war on terror more destructive and longer than it ever otherwise would be. First issue of this debate then is the conceptions of justice. They basically said the ends justify the means, right? We told you that there's a reason that we have moral ends in the first place. We have moral ends to regulate our behaviour, and we have moral ends because they we hold dear to them and they have an effect on how our actions are perceived in the long term. So the things like extrajudicial killing, things like extra-military capture, are all things to undermine the rules of engagement in war. We think those are things we should have a high threshold for breaching. They agree with that basically, right? They said that threshold is breached. They said that in two ways. The first was about the imminent threat of terrorist acts. What did they say? They said there's an imminent threat from people like Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, the ones who hide in caves away from us, lock themselves down from communication, precisely because they're the ones who need to insulate themselves away. They're least likely to have operational command of particular terrorist acts. The ones that they're trying to hunt down and kill are the ones who are so far removed from the operational chain of terrorist attack that they're least likely to be the threat to us. Who are the people who are threats to us? They're the ones who act in the open, they're the ones who act in the West. The terrorist cells in Madrid, the terrorist cells in London, the terrorist cells within the domestic United States, who we already capture regularly under the status quo. We do that through standard military means. That first scaremongering alternative just doesn't hold in this debate, because the terrorists who are most likely to be treated us are the ones who are easiest to capture conventionally. That was the first scare we should just get rid of. The second one was, look, we can't capture the terrorists, we just go to war all over the place. We'll invade every country in the Middle East, and that's going to lead to death and destruction all over the world. Look, the problem is, sometimes we do go to war, right? We went to war with Afghanistan. There's a reason we went to war with Afghanistan. It's because the Afghani state was complicit in funding the terrorists who attacked us. So the Afghani state then actually committed an act of war on us. That's not going to occur in all circumstances, right? Just because there are some terrorists in Somalia, we're not going to be like, oh, Somalia is a huge threat to the United States, let's go and invade their country. And the reason why not is precisely because of the incentives that they gave. When the United States or Europe or any Western country goes to war, a lot of their own civilians die. There's a particularly high threshold which any warmongering politicians have to leave. I think that those conditions aren't going to be justified in most circumstances. So basically at the end of this point, what we say is that the scaremongering alternatives that have been presented to you don't obtain. It's not going to be terrorist attacks all the time. There's the ones that are most dangerous, the ones being easy to capture. And there's not going to be wars precisely because of the political incentives that they have explained in this debate. So given that then, is it worth cashing in our principles to capture these terrorists? This is the point about how these actual mercenaries are going to act. We think these military contractors are different from normal soldiers. They're different because of the reason we told you, that they're likely to have been kicked out of the conventional military. They'll actually have more disciplinary issues. They'll actually be more willing to cash in principles of Christian safety for, like, bang for their buck, basically, literally, right? We think these are the exact people who are the least likely to follow our command structures, that they're going to do destructive things when their behaviour diverges from what we want. We think that they're going to be beholden to who gives them their paycheck, right?
They're going to be holding to Blackwater. Blackwater wants to be an efficient business. But what does that mean in warfare? An efficient business is one where you use like a grenade instead of lots of bullets to clear an area where you have to go in. That means that you cause collateral damage by like obeying the norms of efficiency of the business. That means that they undermine our strategic interests. And we gave you an example of CIA drone action, right? CIA isn't the US military that has committed drone action in Pakistan, but they've done that in a way which has undermined our overall strategic interests. If it's not even the CIA, but a private company, you're likely to make micro decisions which go against the macro picture we want to build as a military, and undermines our larger war effort in a way which is destructive to what we want to achieve. Last thing we think, they're most likely to respond in a way which is their own personal safety. If that means killing more civilians, that's what they will do. It's a brutal outcome of warfare that they incentivize through their model. But then, what did they tell you there? They said, look, that's okay though, because we can hold these mercenaries, these contractors to account. And that's what's going to prevent them from behaving in these ways. We agree, they agree, are brutal. Here's the reason they told you that they're going to hold them to account. They said, look, if they do things we don't like, we just won't pay them. That's going to be great because, they want to get paid. But the problem is, these contracts, as they said at the start, that they're going to say, capture if you can, but if you don't, you can't, then kill. But who are the ones who are going to know about what went on in that particular building, right? It's going to be Blackwater, and you're at least likely to know that information when if Blackwater was the one who presented Osama bin Laden, there wouldn't have been a live stream from the cameras directly into the Oval Office. We have less information and less control over the specific forms of contract performance. Then they said, look, there's going to be more political backlash when a private company does something. That's just absurd, right? Because if a government can outsource its military behaviour to a private contractor, it can more and better insulate itself from political backlash. People in the West say, look, American government, you did something we don't like. They'll say, look, it wasn't us, it was Blackwater, it was private company X, Y, Z. And that insulates them from political pressure and makes them more likely to act in ways which are destructive. Political pressure exists, but it falls to us sometimes. And then they say, look, we can just try them in court. Like, maybe we can, right? But it's very difficult to try them in court sometimes when you have these kinds of jurisdictional issues and they're differences in your own. We think it's very easy within the military structure to overcome those jurisdictional issues because you just court-martial them, right? You have a greater deal of forensic protection through the court system within the military than you do without the military. So for all of those reasons, these safeguards fail catastrophically. So these kinds of contractors that they want are going to be the ones who act more brutally. And finally then, what's the effect of that increased brutality on the war on terror? We think we pour fuel on the flames which lead to the people trying to kill us. And we do that in two ways. The first is through civilian action within the countries, within the people who like to hate us. What we basically do is we give them a reason to hate us more. We steal their resolve against us and they see that we are cashing in our own principles in order to kill some of their own in the short term. We make people on the ground more likely to join Al-Qaeda, more likely to provide them money, more likely to shelter them from us, more likely to withhold information from us in the long term. All of those are negative impacts which deepen and make more inflammatory the terms of the war on terror. That's something we can't avoid. What they say is, look, we undermine trust in terrorist networks because you're going to have these kind of operatives like covertly sneaking into their terrorist cells. It's like, how are they going to do that? Just like chucking on a beard and some dark glasses so they can't tell who they are Afghanistan is. It's just not plausible, that narrative about trust and terrorism. We strengthen the terrorist resources, we give them more people power, we make them fight us harder to the bitter end. Last thing we told you then is about the behaviour of state. This is material that Richard brought here. And this was actually a goal of this out of the house, right? Said we want to build consensus because when consensus fails, it's harder for us to crack down on these terrorists that are in our country. That's precisely what we do want, but we act in the opposite direction to that when we ignore the Pakistani government and just go into their country extrajudicially, basically invade them literally. And that's what strengthens the forces of the ISI against the Pakistani government. That's what makes the ISI, for example, fund terrorist activity in India. Those kinds of behaviours, when we piss off states that don't like us now, even further, by ignoring them, that's exactly the kind of geopolitical effect that strengthens the war on terror and makes them less likely, countries like Syria, countries like Somalia, countries like Egypt, all less likely to be cooperative with us and actually less likely to actually help us get the terrorists that we can, the ones who do pose a threat to us in the long term. At the end of this debate, what we've shown you is that justice matters because justice infuses the decisions we make in warfare. They cash in justice for a solution which leads to more brutality, and that brutality leads to a worse war on terror. And that's why we want this debate. Thank you again for that speech. We now move to the reply portion of this debate, and I invite the first reply from the negative team from Victoria 1, Sebastian Timothy.
we are fighting a different war to one that we fought in the past. And as a response to that, we've opened Guantanamo Bay. We've funded SEAL Team 6. We have pulled Blackwater into Iraq. And we've thrown all of our principles to the dogs of war. The problem is, that's why this war, this very, very different war, is also proving the hardest war there has ever been to win, because of the very way that we responded in the instance that we first responded. So, the three things to discuss today. How should we fight a war? How does such bounty hunters work? And what are the two models' different effects on the war on terror? Very simple questions that both sides agree on. So first of all, how should we fight a war? We said quite strongly inside opposition by principle. They responded to this fairly enough, means justify the means. There wasn't much more they could do there. The problem was they never responded to why those means don't actually fuel the ends themselves, which was a crucial third point. But we did have a discussion about the need to have mercenaries in the interim to avoid fighting long-term wars. We had three responses there. The first thing was, you shouldn't do that if you don't have the response of your citizens to propose you doing that. Those are the people who you represent on the international stage. Those are the people who will bear the consequences if you make bad decisions. You cannot circumvent their wishes. The second response that we gave was, you'll cooperate with some states, and that's what we did with Pakistan, that's what we did with Egypt, that's what we did with a number of European states. To get their people on trial, that's a benefit, you cooperate with states. And thirdly, if the states don't cooperate, then the problem is far more serious than just one or two people on the ground anyway. If these states don't cooperate to give up terrorists that exercise their powers within those borders, then maybe that's the instance that we should think about going to war, and not just surgically take out those terrorists. There's a big problem at hand, and war might not be a bad idea if they're not giving up their terrorists, and therefore are implicit in those crimes. Afghanistan, Iraq, a number of other examples. Second question then, how do bounty hunters work? And we said two crucial things here. They operate on a corporate and personal level, and secondly that they don't operate on a macro level, so they don't have the bigger war interest at heart. There are a number of responses that they gave. The first one was that there's public pressure. Of course there's no public pressure, because the first point that their first speaker gave us was, we want to circumvent the public's ability to control what governments do. Public pressure falls away because they didn't want public pressure, they want to avoid public pressure. Second thing was, they said, we model it out. If you violate the rules, you won't be paid. The problem is we have absolutely no knowledge of what these people do on the ground. And secondly to that, it's not particularly important whether people don't get paid. If they prioritise their own lives in the interim, at the very, very important moment to them, and throw a grenade into a building to clear that because they feel in danger, then not being paid is not such a big deal after that. Thirdly, under this discussion, we talked about their split, which was that you undermine yourself's trust. And if the team think that they can weed out bad mercenaries, then we're going to say equally, we think terrorists are even better at weeding out bad bounty hunters or bad terrorists on their perspective. But secondly, there's absolutely no way that that's what this debate's about. The debate about control and assassination. These people aren't going to be particularly skilled at blending in and looking like Islamic people, looking like the sort of people we're talking about. And finally, on this, we compare these people to the military. So we said that the military is not leaky. Why is the military less leaky than individuals who have all of the information? Because there are command structures. The people on the ground that have the information, in fact, only have very, very limited information in the same way that the cells work. So their analysis of cells works exactly the same for command structured militaries. And secondly, military people follow orders, and if they don't, they can be court-martialed instead of not paid, which was the model that would be their circumstance if these people did something wrong. Final question then is, what are the effects of the two models on the war on terror? Side proposition came up in a number of times. The team line was this. Every single person in this hall is a target of terrorism. Equally, in Balochistan at the moment, SEALs operate, and as a result, Al-Qaeda stand up in halls and say, every single person in this hall is a target of terrorism. It's exactly the same problem, but further to that, they say, not only are the West the terrorists, but the West are the ones denying that they operate in this particular way, when they say that we operate in an offensive way. So the people get exactly the same rhetoric, but it's a rhetoric in a particularly detrimental way, because it's the rhetoric that leads to the problem. What can we do? Break the cycle by not being terrorists to the terrorists. That's what we want to change. We've been blamed for doing nothing. We don't want to walk into a scenario where the war is perpetual. The war at the moment is perpetual. It is different. It is hard to win. That's because what they are doing is harmful. We stand in opposition.
Thank you very much, sir, for that speech. For the final speech of this Grand Final Sports 2011, we invite the affirmative reply from NUS 1, Imran Rahim.
We were never talking about bearded men hiding out in caves. We were talking about clean-shaven men in Italian suits walking openly on the streets of Syria, who go to cafes and shisha joints to openly plot their next attack. Individuals whom Syria will not hand over, plans that we have no access to, where war is not an option and will be infinitely more disastrous. We're sending drones to provoke a response far worse than anything our side would necessarily accrue. The question, ladies and gentlemen, is what is so wrong with us sending bounty hunters to capture these individuals, to throw those cells into disarray and prolong that attack? That was the side, and that was the argument that we were making on this side, and all the arguments about principles, about how lack of accountability just really felt was just pale in comparison. We're looking at the first idea, the idea of accountability. There are going to be two parts to this, right? The accountability of the soldiers on the ground and the accountability of the state making the action. The first argument that they made, right, was quite ridiculous. They're going out there, these people don't follow command structures, you can't control them, they'll go rogue, they'll throw grenades in the air. Like, our answer was simple to that. Like Sadna and Robin argued brilliantly. We just not going to hire individuals who are kicked out of the military. We're going to specifically make sure that the individuals that we hire are individuals who we know and are confident will carry out the kind of things that we want them to carry out. The second response that we gave is that these people operated on a profit incentive. At the moment they know that if they were to go against these direct orders, that they won't get paid, we think this is enough of a deterrent on these individuals. They were deliberately misleading. We said we would capture these individuals in almost all instances, but if we have to kill them, we're fine as well. Moreover, we added the third analysis, right? We said that if we have to try these individuals, we think we will. We have done that before with like Blackwater and NXC. We think that the same principle applies here. We think it's infinitely harder for us to try US soldiers, especially the kind of jingoism and heroism that surrounds these individuals. Then we wanted the second idea, right? The accountability of the state. Their argument was that the state can deny like everything and get away scot-free. But we used several responses to that. Firstly, we said that we're going to have, and we think that individuals like Bradley Manning, think of example WikiLeaks, do exist to ensure that we can maintain and keep these people accountable for the actions that they create, for the atrocities they may necessarily be complicit with. Never responded to by the other side. But more importantly, who are we going to trust? Because on this side, let's assume the worst coming from the other side. We think we'd rather trust the state than trust the terrorists walking openly in the streets and hoping for the best that these people won't attack our cities and our homes. That's something that we are willing to take. The second idea, the idea of principles, right? Because they said the principles are so overwhelmingly important that we must always adhere to them. Our argument again was simple. We think this is fine, we will always adhere to them. In fact, we think this was adhering to principles because these individuals consent to the kind of repercussions that will befall them with the provocation of the war and voicing this war on individuals. But beyond that, where do your principles lie when that bomb goes off? Where do your principles lie when mothers, fathers, and children are killed, when all you could do and all you have to do was to go in and capture that one individual? All the other options like drones, well, that's going to provoke a worse response. Wars are going to be infinitely more disastrous, and we've seen the effects in Iraq and Afghanistan, and deliberation is far too slow. With that context in mind, what is so wrong with hiring these bounty hunters? And the last idea, the idea of hearts and minds. I don't get this. On one hand, they say that the state can deny all names to these people, yet on the other hand, there will be backlash. They've really got to decide between one or the other. But beyond that, we said precisely because we want to circumvent backlash, that's why we are hiring these bounty hunters without the flags on their arms, so that we can go in for these individuals without the repercussions that I highlighted in my first speaker speech. The death and morale of the military, when you capture an individual with an American flag on his shoulder, on his arm, and the kind of visceral assault that's going to come about as the corollary of these individuals being caught for such attacks and for such operations. It is ugly, it is not ideal, but it is necessary. This important motion must stand.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much all the speakers. Let's give them another round of applause.
다 나가죠. 다 나가죠.
오빠 잠깐만.
다들 지금 밥 주지 말라 그러. 밥 나중에 줄 거니까 밥 주지 말라 그러.
Okay, guys. Dinner is ready. Which is the best dinner you ever ate in Korea. And you have a section for halal and vegetarian food. And the other table, which is not assigned, is non-halal and non-vegetarian food. We have tons of food.